Hi, I'm Violet, and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans and experts. Today on Hidden Heritage, I'm joined by Senior Director at Sotheby's, David Macdonald. From first beginning his career as an auction house porter, David joined Sotheby's in 2001 and has since become the world's foremost specialist in the sale of contemporary and historic valuables. Everything from old master paintings, one-of-a-kind watches, wine and modern art. David has insight and experience valuing them and finding them at home. David has an incredible ability to identify, and he understands how objects can tell a story of our past. And this is something I'm really excited to discuss with him later in the show. On today's episode, David outlines how his career in preservation began. We discuss some of the most fascinating and impactful objects he has come across. We also discuss the key challenges that houses face when deciding to make a sale. David gives us his 3 destination recommendations as well. But first, let's get to know David a little bit better. David, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. How are you, first of all?
I'm very good. And I'm blushing slightly at the introduction.
No, well, it's all true.
It's incredibly flattering.
Well, it's all true. And I'm so excited to be able to bring your story, your career to our listeners, because Sotheby's has got this kind of, you say Sotheby's and everyone gets very excited. And I think having met you, a couple of months ago, and I instantly just felt you kind of embody so much of what I think of as Sotheby's, which is just, this rich kind of historical, living and breathing kind of entity. So I'm really excited to dive into the conversation. But needless to say, can you just give I've done a brief introduction, but can you just give us an introduction to who you are?
Well, I am one of the luckiest men in the art world. Mm-hmm. I think, because I get to explore not just extraordinary houses and delve into amazing collections, but meet really interesting and wonderful people. Mm-hmm. And I should say as well, I'm actually one of a team. Mm-hmm. So it's not just me waving the flag out there on my own. There's lots of people who share that, who share those experiences. But I'm often first in, usually through work, actually, through Sotheby's. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, amazing.
Yeah.
So just take us back.
Okay.
Where did your right back. Where did it all start for you?
So I was always really interested, and I had always loved the past. I think I grew up in the countryside in Scotland, and I was very conscious of history and what was around me as a child. And I went to school in Edinburgh, and Edinburgh is almost like a set piece. It's like a sort of Disneyland of historic buildings and structures. I mean, in the middle of the city, there's a great big castle, on a volcano. I mean, it's the stuff that kids' dreams are made of, if you're interested in that sort of thing, like I was. So that sort of triggered it. And then university, I did history of art at university. I travelled, delaying tactics. And a family friend said, if you're really interested, why don't you get a job as a porter? So I got a job at Christie's, one of the other great auction houses in London, in the furniture room. So I was the guy in the apron who'd hold the painting during the sale next to the auctioneer. And I spent a year and a half, but it was an amazing way of learning.
I bet.
I remember someone saying to me quite early on, the better something is, the heavier it is. So those early experiences were brilliant. And it was a really young crowd, and, we'd be in the pub a lot after work. And it was great, great fun.
Wow.
And then I left Christie's and got a job on the valuations counter. So when you come into an auction house, you're bringing in Granny's vase or your favourite piece of jewellery, you go to the reception and you're met by a very affable girl or guy who basically take the piece from you, and then they'll phone a colleague who's usually upstairs in their office to come down and meet you. So you see these things and you hear colleagues talking about them. You hear what these things might be worth on a really crass end, but conversely, you're also learning a lot. So those two things were quite sort of proper introductions to working in an auction house and understanding objects. Wow. And then I moved into the furniture department, and I started cataloguing early English furniture. So oak furniture and Windsor chairs, and loved that. That was really good. I had some lovely mentors teaching me at the warehouse about things. Wow. And then from that, I then got involved in what we call special collections. So we had a big sale at Chatsworth, an attic sale for the Devonshires.
What year was that?
That was in 2010.
Okay.
So I'd been in the furniture department working on, cataloguing furniture and putting sales together. And then my big break at Sotheby's was the Chatsworth attic sale. And it was an amazing experience. And that was spending time in the attics at Chatsworth. And it's a big house. So there are many, many attics full of all sorts of bits and pieces. And like very smart families. The Devonshires had an amazing house on Piccadilly called Devonshire House. It's a great mansion above Green Park Tube ticket office, where Marks and Spencer's is, for those of you that know London, was where the wine cellars and silver storerooms were of Devonshire House. If you, next time you're getting your ticket or on the tube, you're like, yes, this is where all these wonderful bottles of wine and bits of silverware. The house, like lots and lots of those great London mansions. I think Evelyn Waugh even writes about it. The 1920s, catastrophic. Death duties, after the war, running a stately home in the countryside and having a London mansion. It just wasn't something that these great families could do. Devonshire House was demolished, absolutely flattened, along with some other great houses. And the contents were packed up, wrapped in straw. The marble fireplaces, the doors, even the light switches were packed up and sent up to Chatsworth. It was like, if you think about an IKEA bed, you know what I mean? Imagine a William Kent 1730s drawing room flat packed.
Mad.
And the idea was that they might use these fittings and fixtures somewhere. But they sat at Chatsworth quietly, really since the 1920s.
Gosh.
So the Duke invited us to come and put together this attic sale. And that was based around these amazing rooms. So we brought everything out of the attics above the stables. And we got old photographs from Country Lives and hired this big old warehouse in West London. It was the old DHL warehouse, so like a big concrete hangar. And then I got lots of gaffer tape and I divided the warehouse up into sections and had an easel on each of these big squares with photos of the room.
Gosh.
And it was, light switch. Okay, looking at the photos. Okay, that's from the ballroom.
No way.
Because the stuff was just involved. Well, we had a big team working on it, but it was amazing. And then slowly but surely, this great lost treasure house sort of came to life.
It's so interesting, David. Just before we jump on to, I'm so excited to hear about your first recommendation and favourite place. But what are the origins of attic sales?
Oh, okay. So actually the first attic sale, well, this is what I know. So anyone listening might be, oh no, that's not true. But was it my colleague James Miller, who is extraordinary, was chairman at Sotheby's. And he was very, very involved in the country house and single owner sales that we did back in the day, and still is actually.
Wow.
He's an amazing consultant. Anyway, James put on a sale for the contents of the attics at Castle Howard. I mean, the quintessential country house. And that was a big, big deal at the time.
When was that?
I think it was the early to mid 80s.
Okay.
I don't know the exact date, but the Castle Howard attic sale was quite seminal. And I think around the same time, Christie's did an attic sale of the contents of the attics and stores at Harwood. So lots of Chippendale fragments and bits and pieces. And in a way, those sales, if you think about it, when you're going through life, the things that you put in a suitcase, old photos or bits under the bed or in the attic yourself or personally, they mark moments in your life. They mark the journey of something. And like a country house, those attics are sort of like cutting into a tree and looking at the rings. Do you know what I mean?
So true.
You'll find like the fireplaces from Devonshire House or Debo Mitford's record player.
Who was the great Duchess of Devonshire.
Yeah, the great kind of, who was transformative in our understanding of country houses and the way that she lived and inhabited Chatsworth. And an extraordinary patron of artists, She really brought Lucian Freud into Chatsworth. So, those attic sales have been great and great marketing tools as well.
Yeah, but is it something to be sad about as well, an attic sale? Because there's a part of me that my soul slightly sinks as well when we talk about attic sales, because the reality is, and I understand it from past experience, but also just from reading up about them over the years. I mean, I love the idea that people can purchase these great kind of collections. But to your point, those rings, when you cut into a tree and you look at those rings, it forms the identity of that tree. And these collections that have been gathered over hundreds of years in most instances, by virtue of selling them off in an attic sale, the collection's gone. It's no longer together and it's sort of in its original home. And
I think that's such a good point. I think there is that intellectual tension about preservation versus moving on. And I mean, you'll know this as well through lots of the great houses that you work with. There is that tension. Often it between it being a family home and the huge demands and financial pressures that families go through. And often the attic is the first place to go to, oh, we don't want to sell the Titian in the drawing room, but actually there's a whole load of old fireplaces up in the, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and I think, I feel that these houses are about life, and sometimes the families that are part of them are more important, and it's I know there's a sense of course, David the Sotheby's man would say that. But remember, lots of that stuff was bought by these families on grand tours, traveling in Europe, or they bought it from sales themselves. At Chatsworth, there are things from country house sales. The Wanstead House, the great mansion that was demolished, and the huge sale in the 1820s. Throwing those things up in the air, or taking those elements from Devonshire House, the great mansion that we talked about, out and putting them in a catalogue and photographing them. It gives their time, gets them out there again, and maybe it brings them to a wider audience. You could say, well, actually, this stuff could stay in the attic and be seen by a very small group of people, but perhaps our understanding of, I don't know, architecture in the 18th century and looking at William Kentish as a designer, it was he that designed Devonshire House. They're quite valuable moments. And then all of a sudden the art auction becomes part of the history of our collecting and that country house narrative. And
I think of Sotheby's as storytellers first and foremost, alongside them being, a commercial machine and empire. But I think actually of Sotheby's as being this incredible vehicle of storytelling. And I guess by virtue of selling attic items, you're kind of extending the life of that item instead of it sitting in an attic, which I think is a wonderful way to look at it. And that kind of brings us on quite nicely to your first location, because it's a National Trust property.
It is.
And by virtue of being National Trust, it's beautifully kind of situated in time. And I'd love you to share more.
What time is that? So this sort of comes back to that point that we were making about that tension between an auction and a collection, and Sotheby's or Christie's coming along and getting involved, and then everyone being, oh no. So the house I'm going to talk about is Calke Abbey in the Derbyshire countryside. The most glorious house. I love it.
I'd never heard of it until you sent it to me.
Oh my goodness, I love it.
Why?
I love it because it's got a complicated history. It was built in the early 18th century by the Harper family on a much earlier site, a sort of 12th century priory.
Okay. And the Harper family were
kind of landowners and
not industrialists. They
were old school. I think very ancient aristocrats that sort of had gone back into the mists of time. And they built this incredible Baroque mansion in the countryside, which you really do discover. You sort of wind your way through the park, down this drive, through these ancient trees. And I went quite recently, and it was one of those days where it was very warm, but very still. You could hear it whenever there was a tiny bit of wind, the trees and the grass was sort of, it was
magical.
Like in a movie, Sort of got to this great house and went in, and it was the one that got away. So Sotheby's in the early 80s began the process of dismantling it to label up and catalogue the things. It was going to be, the family were hit, I think, with double death duties.
Yeah, I saw so it went to the National Trust in 1981, I think.
Yeah.
And it was Henry Harper, I think, who handed it over.
Who were amazing kind of characters in their own right, and passionate about the house and the house's history. And I think they had, the entire estate was worth about £14 million. And I think the death duties and taxes owed were about £8 million. So it's a big deal. I mean, it was just not sustainable for the family to keep. And it was a huge heritage moment. Everyone felt passionately about this place. So it's great that we didn't get our paws on it. I feel so pleased that moment, those sales didn't happen. I think one of the big issues is, if you have a great house, is having the money in an endowment to pay for it.
Yes.
And I think the money from the land on the estate would never have been enough to keep the house going. So there had to be, I think there was a special moment in Parliament where the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, it came up, and I think the government allocated money to save it.
I see.
So it's a great story in terms of saving something.
Yeah.
But for me, the magic is when you go through those doors, nothing has changed.
And that's what I was fascinated by, because I read that, and the National Trust made a concerted decision, like a collective decision, to not touch any of it when they walked in, which is really amazing.
Every wall, every light switch, everything has that little bit of dust, or it's all looked after and cared for exquisitely. But every time I got the sense that every time the Harpers and the next generation came along, they closed the door on a suite of rooms or whatever.
To save on electricity and everything else, probably.
They didn't even have electricity.
Okay.
I think that came really late. In fact, you couldn't even take a car up to the front of the house. You get picked up in a pony and trap. We're not talking about the 1900s. This isn't Bridgerton. This is like, the 1970s and 80s.
Wow.
You get taken to the front door and it was lit often by candles. So an insurance nightmare.
Yeah.
Catastrophic, But how magical. And I kept thinking about the people lucky enough to go there during the Harper Cruise residency in the 20th century and seeing that house lit by candlelight. Because every wall, the wallpapers, they're quite sort of decayed. It's like an exercise, the most amazing coffee table book with kind of haunting images of rooms. And you go into the nursery and there'll be a rocking horse and toys and Noah's Ark with all the animals spilled out on the floor. It is exactly as it was when the Harper Cruise left. The clock stopped. It's a very intimate experience wandering around. You feel that it's not invasive. You don't feel like you're being nosy, but you feel like it's special.
Yeah.
Very special.
And do you feel like it's kind of, I guess because it's sort of semi-frozen in time, but in an amazing way, because you're getting to see what it was like just before they handed it across to the National Trust and it was saved.
And it's not, I'd hate anyone to think, it sounds a bit gimmicky. It sounds a bit like Harry Potter world. It's not. It's not. You have the joy of the gardens that sort of envelop the house. The house sort of sits there almost bobbing around in this sort of rolling verdant countryside. I remember I was waiting for it. I'd been to see a client for Sotheby's and I went to the house and I was getting a taxi back to a station. And when you go to a country house or to a great property, you think, right, okay, gift shop, restaurant, cup of coffee, want to take maze.
Yeah.
Especially if you've got kids, you want to do, you've got to do it all, But I just took some time and sat down on this sort of wooden fence, and looked at the trees and thought, am I sounding a bit of an old lush now?
No, but that's why I think these places are so extraordinary. And be it, a National Trust property or an independent house that's still in family hands, I think what's amazing is that they are these kind of incredible lighthouses, really dotted across the country.
That's such a good word, lighthouses.
Are serene. That there's a serenity to them that you just don't find in this day and age.
That's such a good point, because we're very conscious of mindfulness, actually.
Totally.
And it's not particularly busy. And the guides there are lovely. You don't have to sort of have someone right beside you telling you about that's the 4th Baronet. You can kind of explore on your own. There's space there and there are glorious things in it. I mean, my background is furniture at Sotheby's.
So what would be your favourite items in that?
Well, there is such a profusion of taxidermy. It's slightly overwhelming.
Really?
So yeah, it's kind of like, oh my goodness, they collected stuffed animals and butterflies and insects in a way that is, it's...
Where does that come from, this kind of obsession with taxidermy? Because I've seen it in lots of the houses I've been to in the last year, and it was a real thing.
It was huge.
Yeah.
I think it comes from that. So we're used to going, I'm just going to Google a picture of a polar bear. You know what I mean? I think it comes from that sense of the exotic and that fascination, particularly if you were rich, to capture something and actually... Collections of natural history were as important as collections of paintings or marbles or tapestries. Kunstkammer, that word to describe a room of wonder. They would have maybe a stuffed crocodile. This goes way back to the Renaissance, the wonder rooms. And I think that tradition of collecting and saying, well, I have a beautiful portrait by Reynolds of my father, but conversely, I also have all these wonderful shells.
Yes.
If you're in Derbyshire to come across a collection of seashells from the Caribbean or a tiger.
Big news.
That's big news. That's like, that's proper show and tell stuff, isn't it? After dinner.
And they were so fastidious in how they documented it all and how they, their love for these kind of slightly random collections to the sort of naked, modern day eye. But actually historic, again, it's just another treat.
There's something as well. You think about artists like Damien Hirst and lots of his work, his really seminal pieces, the shark and formaldehyde. I think he's sort of referencing that.
Interesting.
And now when we see them, it is a bit horrifying. You do think, oh no, it's a bit sad, isn't it? I'd much rather see that in the wild or running up a tree or something.
But equally, everything's we've all got a shelf life. And actually, if it's going to be preserved in perfect formation, and we can look at it 100 years later.
Yeah, you might see me stuffed at Sotheby's. And of course, we've not touched on bad taxidermy, which is another
big category.
Funny faces and strange looking expressions.
Well, how amazing. I'm so, I honestly, I hadn't heard of Calke Abbey. Yeah. I hadn't heard of Calke Abbey until you told me a few days before we started recording. And I'm just, I think it's an amazing one for our listeners to sort of seek out. Is it close to Chatsworth, Haddon? Yeah,
you could do your own Northern Grand Tour. You could go to Derbyshire and you could go to Haddon and Chatsworth and see Calke, and Melbourne as well. It's beautiful. Melbourne. Whole beautiful, beautiful house, quite intimate house, which is amazing.
It's funny because Derbyshire, everyone thinks of Chatsworth, but actually there's so many incredible places.
Totally, it's a bit like the showstopper Chatsworth, but actually often we're so focused on experiencing. Oh God, you've got to go to Chatsworth, of course. But actually, the little guys, are big punchers. They punch above their weight, definitely.
Majestic. So we're going to move on, but thank you. That was an amazing first recommendation. Many people have got a kind of either very granular understanding as to what it means to be an auctioneer or part of something like Sotheby's, but many others don't. So can you just explain to us, give us an understanding of what it means to be in your line of work and what kind of talents and gifts you need to have to be successful, like you very much have been, and your team sounds like are as well.
Well, it's a very unique position. And it's one of great trust as well, because essentially you're going into someone's home and you're looking at their things. Those things are often imbued with sentimental, huge meaning. And I think you have to be really conscious and really respectful of that. I mean, I think ultimately Sotheby's are a commercial company. We're not a heritage body. And that storytelling is often to add value. So it's important to remember that. You have to be so conscious of the way that people feel about the places they inhabit. And indeed, the people that work there. And sometimes I feel, I arrive, come up the drive, and it might be for a routine insurance valuation, and you can see the housekeeper or whatever, and they sink slightly, and no, we're not selling anything. I'm just here we're just here for an insurance valuation. I mean, and as I said before, I mean, all the sales are not necessarily, in the auction house world, you say the 3 Ds: death, divorce, or debt.
Yes.
And it's not always about that. Sometimes it is about freeing space or to make a change or to restore something or to, So I think it's part of the story. I think,
And when was Sotheby's founded?
In 1744. So we've been around a long time. It feels like I've been there since 1744 sometimes.
You don't look it, David. And also what I find so fascinating is I imagine that single collection, single home owner, how do I...
Single owner sales.
Single owner sales. Yeah. I imagine they are the collections that are alongside the Freddie Mercury sort of gangbuster collection sales. But I imagine that single home owner sales of historic houses have got to have been some of the biggest sort of over the last, since the beginning of Sotheby's, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are very, very historic sales of houses. I think lots of houses are much better at understanding in terms of tax liability. So the reasons for selling perhaps are not, people are better at managing things and setting up trusts and making sure that things are accessible to the public through exemption. So that's a scheme the government run to pass things down through a family. But absolutely rightly, you have to make sure that people can see those things.
Yeah.
And you have to share them with others.
Yeah.
You can't just go, I'll keep this in my bedroom. And the idea behind that scheme was to stop treasures being sold at Christie's and Sotheby's and being exported overseas. So the idea was to keep them in the UK and in the context in which they were made.
Yeah. So
that tradition of house sales has been a big part of the narrative. I think the big sales are, possibly, I don't think things of the past, but I think if there are sales now connected to a country house, they're usually smaller affairs. They're attic sales, like we talked about, or they're sales from an apartment or a cut. Do you know what I mean? There are little bits and pieces.
Do they tend to have quite a lot of fascination around them? Because
people love them.
Yeah.
Because
why do you think that is?
I think it's because people feel real ownership. I remember doing the attic sale at Chatsworth, and there were so many lovely people that came into. We put a big marquee up on the lawn in front of the house. There were thousands of people that came through that marquee, and I remember one really lovely lady saying, Chatsworth, you see, it's our Buckingham Palace. That's our, that building. I've known it since I was a child, and lots of people have. That might be through a movie or whatever. So there's that sort of resonance at a local level, and And if the house is known internationally, it speaks to people in different ways. And obviously we're there capitalizing on that. But conversely, coming back to an earlier point, it sort of gets it out there a bit more.
True. I completely agree. And when I was reading about the items that you've touched and held, Winston Churchill's dispatch box to Marilyn Monroe's basket, I was like, this is just amazing. So what would be your favourite treasures that you've come across?
Finally, that's the hardest question in the world. Okay, so can I do two?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Or three even, if you want to really go wild.
So the dispatch box, Churchill's dispatch box, was in his daughter Mary Solmes's house, and it was in the hall. And Mary Solmes used it to keep, excuse this, she had a dog. She'd keep her empty bags that you would use when you go out with your dog.
No.
So it was her poo bag box, basically.
No.
And I love that sense of, I don't know.
There's
it doesn't
something
denigrate
British about that.
Yeah,
there really is.
But it's also, it doesn't take anything too seriously.
Exactly.
And I think I never met her, but she sounded like someone who was pretty cool,
Really?
Yeah, and that irreverence for an object associated with a great man. So that a dispatch box is one of those red boxes, and there's a budget. He holds up the box, and it has each incoming minister gets one, and they keep their papers of state in there. So this was Churchill's. And I think it ended up selling for about 130,000. We sold the contents of our house. So that was a magical thing in the sense that it was an important object in British political and cultural history. But I love the fact there was an element of irreverence by the person that owned it.
Because at the end of the day, it was just her father. It was
her dad's, yeah. And that's why it was significant to her. Aside from being useful.
Yeah. But it was
but it was her dad's. And I think that is so powerful and can be incredibly moving sometimes.
I bet. I find that very moving because at the end of the day, we all think of Churchill as being the great wartime leader. But actually, to her, it was her dad, and the fact that she's using them for her poo bags for the dog.
And what papers what was kept in that box?
Amazing.
Plans for deed. I mean, what papers of state did Churchill keep in there? I mean, it's amazing.
That's amazing. So when was that sale?
It was called Daughter of History.
Okay.
And it was pictures and paintings and objects from Mary Solmes' home in Holland Park. So it was just after she died. No, I bet you I've got the date wrong. I'm going to say it was 2015.
Okay. That's quite
But
recent.
do forgive me if I've got that wrong.
No, well, yeah.
Might do a little fact check on that one.
Yeah, okay.
But if you Google Sotheby's Mary Solmes' Daughter of History,
yeah,
you'll come straight
we'll
away.
Find it. Okay, so that'd be number one.
That'd be number one. And then the other one is another object. I mean, I come from a decorative arts background, which is furniture and, objects that you associate with grand rooms and houses. But I worked for this extraordinary collector who had the most amazing house, who's called Stanley Seeger, and his partner, Christopher Cohn. And they were collectors on an epic scale. They owned a house briefly called Sutton Place, which is an Elizabethan mansion near Guildford. And they furnished it with Picassos and treasures. And it was a very private world, collecting and buying things that amused them or were interesting or a little bit different. And we were very fortunate. I got to work very closely with Christopher Cohn, Stanley Seeger's partner. He was a most wonderful man. Very special, is much loved at Sotheby's because we know him so well because of the various sales he did. And one of those sales had an object that was really magical. So in 1960, there was an infamous court case. D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover was published by Penguin Books, and it rocked society. Yeah. It was scandalous, and there was an obscenity trial to prevent its publication. It's real hairs on the back of the neck.
It really is. And why? Just for our listeners, why was it so outrageous that book?
It was very explicit. So it was
for that time.
For that time, yeah. It wasn't your Agatha Christie. You know what I mean? It was it was about this raw love between Lady Chatterley and her gardener, and depicted in. Although the thing is, it's not. It wasn't written, I suppose, in a sexy, erotic way. It was written in a, it was about their relationship, and the sex was a big part of it. Anyway, it's just a strange thing to be talking about on a Country House podcast, but it sort of relates.
Yeah, it is.
At the house, Chris said, I've got something to show you. And he pulled out a small damask bag, okay, hand-stitched, and it was a sort of grey damask, the kind of damask that you'd see used in curtains. And inside was a battered copy of the 1960 edition, that edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover. And inside it was annotated in coloured pencil. So whenever there was something that was a bit fruity or a bit sexy, there was a line under it saying,
No way.
graphic, or, what this was. This was the judge's copy from the trial. And his wife had made him the bag to keep the copy in so no one would
Hidden
see
away.
it.
Oh my
And
gosh.
his wife, so this was a guy called, she was Lady Dorothy Byrne. So he was a very famous judge called Sir Lawrence Byrne.
Mm-hmm.
And Lady Dorothy Byrne had read it for him and annotated it for him so he could be fully aware of all the facts. But a bit like that dispatch box, it feels particularly British, doesn't it, to make this beautiful embroidered pouch for it.
Exactly, and sort of tuck away this outrageous, novel.
But that novel marked, in British popular culture, a change in everything.
Yeah.
So the judge found in favour of Penguin, and the book was published. The trial ended up making the book sell 2 million copies. So it had the exact opposite effect. But it was 1960, and it marked a turning point in sexual politics, in liberation. The 60s, as we know, became
Swinging
this period,
60s.
the swinging 60s.
Yeah.
And I think that's often seen as a bookmark. There's the opening,
Is it really?
the epilogue, that moment when they go, not guilty, we're throwing this out.
Yeah.
And Penguin can go ahead and publish.
And it sort of lit it was the match to the fire.
I mean, there was and I think there's an outrageous comment. It's extraordinary. So the the person saying, we're not, this is wrong, said, is this a book that young boys, even young daughters, and then he said, girls can read as well, should be reading? Is it a book you would want lying around at home that your wife might read, or even your servants? I mean, that's a credible thing to say in 1960.
Wow.
I mean, so I've probably slightly misquoted, but that statement in itself represents the old world, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. It really does.
And a really strange, it's
that
slightly outrageous
tension between
thing
the young and young and old, and how fascinating.
Yeah. So that object literally sort of vibrated, hummed with British history and in a different way to some of the more usual objects that we might see at Sotheby's from country houses or
and that was
collections.
sold.
And that was sold in, I think, about 2016.
Wow.
Yeah, in a sale called A Private View. So it was property from the country home, a beautiful house in the countryside of Stanley Seeger and Christopher Cone.
Gosh.
And in fact, in a way, you were talking about the great sales of stately homes. That sale is maybe a sort of marker for a different kind of sale, a modern personality or the modern collector.
Yeah.
And that might be a celebrity, or that might be someone like Stanley Seeger, who was this extraordinary connoisseur of all things beautiful and interesting.
Fascinating. Really cool. So they'd be your two favourites.
Well, there's loads, but I don't want to go on too much because you'll be like, oh God, all right.
Okay. And then I love this question, particularly to you. So if you could go back in time and salvage and save one, it could be two if I'm being generous, but one or two items, what would you save?
I mean, that's the best question ever. Are you allowed, could you say a house?
Absolutely. And just give our listeners context as to why you say a house, because there were a lot that were lost.
I know, there are a lot. And
what period of time were they lost, and why did that come about?
I think the demise of the country, there's some amazing books about that. And again, the Country Life Archive, those snapshots of these hauntingly beautiful places that have gone forever. They're such a part of our fabric in the British Isles. You can think it's a fundamental. And it's not just about people at the very high end who lived there collecting beautiful things. It's about the people that worked and lived and loved on those estates. And the significance locally. That lady at the Chatsworth attic sale who said, this is our Buckingham Palace, And there's a house in Scotland, a very, very famous house, that was demolished in 1921. And that was Hamilton Palace, which was one of the great kind of buildings. And that's it's a bit of my, there's a dreaming about this house. I think about it a lot.
Where was it?
It was in Lanarkshire in Scotland.
Okay.
And it was one of those houses, the estate had been pretty ravaged by the industrialisation of Scotland. The land was was rich in coal. It wasn't quite like Wentworth Woodhouse, which was famously affected by mining.
But somehow still stands.
Somehow still there, isn't it? Hamilton Palace was more a house that was about family fortunes and declining. And you had a duke who was collecting, who had married William Beckford, another great 19th century collector, 18th, 19th century collector, the daughter of William Beckford. What was left of the Beckford collection came up. Then you had the Hamiltons, who were they're the premier aristocrats in Scotland. So they're the the king's hand, if you like, or the queen's hand in Scotland. And they created this edifice. It was like Versailles. It was huge, built in about, I think it was in it was early 18th century or very end of the 17th century. Incredible house. And they set about filling it with treasures. The works of art in that house were so significant. This Christie's had a big sale in the 1880s. It was a massive sale. It went on for days and days.
Why were they selling at that point in time? Because they were already running
debt, horses, yachts. And I think, again, it wasn't so much inheritance tax in that period. That was sort of slightly later. But I think the high living and just the cost, and it seems to mark that period of things are changing here. To have palaces, and collections are moving, and that sale really did throw everything out there.
Wow.
And in the world's greatest museums, from the Met to the Louvre to the V&A, there are things from Hamilton Palace.
Is there really? Wow.
So imagine going in there and seeing that house intact today.
And then it was demolished in 1921.
It was demolished in 1921. And the fittings, the architectural fittings were sold off. So you can go into the National Museums of Scotland on Chambers Street, the main museum in Edinburgh, and you can see a part of the drawing room. There's a wall with a fireplace and things.
Wow.
And then in American museums, there's amazing rooms that have been rebuilt, the paneling that was sold, because they sold everything. Everything from the cows in the fields to the fat paneling to the whole lot. There was a sale.
Just makes me so sad. I just how did anyone ever allow this to happen? These kind of places were allowed to be demolished, because we'll never build something like Hamilton Palace ever again in our lifetime or any future.
Yeah, it was. It's. I think, and it's much talked about Hamilton Palace
up in Scotland in particular.
Yeah, up in Scotland, and I think it is seen as one of the great losses. Because it wasn't like Stowe where the collection was dispersed, but the house is still there. Yes. An amazing park. It's gone. It's gone forever. And it exists through those country life photos.
I know. Okay, so from one sad story about beautiful Hamilton Palace, which everyone can Google, to somewhere that everyone can actually see, which is Plas Newydd, I believe, is your second place.
Yes.
And so tell us about Plas Newydd. Where is it, and why did you choose it as your second destination?
Plas Newydd, I suppose, in the UK, there are other houses. We talked about Castle Howard, which are perhaps more Instagrammable. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. But there's something about the people that inhabited Plas Newydd and its geography as well, actually.
Its geography is stunning.
It's like a little Gothic biscuit tin that sits on the banks of the Menai Strait. So you've got the sparkling waters of the Menai Strait.
Sparkling in the summers, and then in the winter. This is North Wales that we're talking about. So this is like
on the island of Anglesey.
Yeah.
And in the background, you can see the mountains of Snowdonia, these wonderful peaks. And it's this sort of fairy tale Gothic house that sits there, home to the Paget family for generations. The house that we see today is a sort of Gothic fantasy from the very late 18th century, built by a Paget who was a real patron of the arts. They're an amazing family. Each generation has these extraordinary personalities.
And
characters. Yeah.
And so I think the architect was James Wyatt.
That's right,
Same as Beaver.
Yeah.
Same as Windsor Castle.
Yeah.
Which is quite amazing. And actually, when I was reminding myself of Plas Newydd, because I went up there in 2018.
Yeah.
But I can really, James Wyatt, his stamp was those kind of rotund, that rotund sort of shape to his buildings that he created. But yeah, you're right. So the family are fascinating. What in particular, one or two characters?
I will touch on a couple of characters. There's loads.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
the famous
the hero of Waterloo who had a wooden leg, and in that British way, I think his leg came off, and he was like, "Oh, I think I've lost my leg." It was all very kind of like stuff and nonsense. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, crack on.
It was brilliant, and he lived till he was a champion yachtsman with one leg.
Staggering.
I mean, that's like really early Paralympian almost. He was out there, started the America's Cup. Amazing character, military hero, really dashing, loads of kids, very interesting. And then you skip a couple, all still very, very interesting. And then you have the fifth Marquis, who is amazing. And again, a lot of the things we've been talking about, I think are completely driven by film, and I'm wanting to see a movie about these people or houses.
I know.
Oh my gosh, Henry Cyril Paget, the fifth Marquis, was extraordinary. His nickname was Toppy, and he inherited when he was very young Plas Newydd and an amazing house called Beau Desert.
Yes, which is no longer.
Which is no longer. Another great house that was lost in Staffordshire. He inherited a lot of money, but he set about making his interpretation. I think that's how you would describe the curation of the house and things. He turned the chapel into a theatre called the Gaiety. He redecorated the rooms. He bought obsessively from jewelers and created the most incredible gowns. I mean, the photographs of him wearing like sort of winged hats, like a Valkyrie, and gowns, sort of diaphanous gowns. He had a famous dance called the butterfly dance that he'd perform behind a spotlight. Yeah. And he'd have these wings on sticks. Now, can you imagine a Welsh community?
Yeah.
And this guy arrives.
What a character.
Oh my God. And it's really moving, actually. Societally, people were really funny about him. This is just before Oscar Wilde. You know, this is kind of like, there wasn't room really at the table for characters like Toppy Paget. You know, he was pilloried, he was laughed at as well. And I think he seemed to be a bit self-obsessed.
Yes.
You know, loved himself. But he was a good guy. And, you know, he'd drive around Mayfair and he had a perfume filter filtered to his exhaust pipe. So when his car was driving through, he loved fast cars, there'd be this waft of perfume behind him, you know. He had all these dogs that he'd dress up. I mean, he was just, those are just some of the stories.
People have to Google him that are listening. Whilst you're describing him, if you can pull up a picture and look at a picture of Toppy whilst David describes him, it's so worthwhile doing, because it was only when I went to Plas Newydd, I'd never heard of him before. And then you go there and sadly a lot of his collections was sold.
He was in terrible debt. So he died at the age of 29.
God, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he died really young. And the trustees I think they gave him quite a hard time in his lifetime. I think he was not what you had a military hero, you had these guys that were very, in the 19th century, his predecessors who were stiff upper lip, he was the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
But the really interesting thing, and this is so touching, he was much loved by the community that he lived in. So at his funeral, there's this really touching moment when people from the village turn up in droves, like hardened local guys and their wives and their children, and they're there to say goodbye. And I think that's so moving. I mean, to me, again, it has to be a film, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
He died in France, actually.
Okay,
I don't know, actually.
Okay.
I think I should do a bit more research on him. But his wife he married. This was the other thing. His wife was by his side when he died. So he was much, much loved by those close to him and by the community in which he lived. But, he
burnt through a lot of a lot of money.
A lot of cash, yeah. Wartsky of Llandudno, who, very famous jewellers, they had a shop in Wales. And he basically was their number one customer, buying beautiful things to wear. And interestingly, they then have premises in London. They were the very famous jewellers. They sold Fabergé, and they're still around. But he was, and a very early patron of Wartsky, and I'm sure in some ways helped lay the foundations of that really successful family business through his patronage.
Wow.
But what a guy.
What a guy. And also what a footprint he left actually on, because I think I remember saying after he died, he'd knocked through the three servants' quarters and turned them into a dining room, or rather Marjorie and...
So the next chapter is just as interesting. So when Toppy died, at the house, there was massive sales to raise money because they really were there was real problems. Family pictures and portraits and silver and bits of furniture were protected by the trust, so were not allowed to be sold, which meant that important family things were still in the house. So when the 6th Marquess, who's a very glamorous character, came along, and I think that was the 5th Marquess, Toppy's nephew.
Not Charles.
I think, came along, there were still things there. It wasn't like he was left with an empty house. And he, of course, married the very, very beautiful and wonderful Lady Marjorie Manners, an ancestor of yours. We did some research. We did a sale from the private apartments at the house. It's now by the National Trust, but the family have an apartment on the top floor, the current Marquess. And I did lots and lots of reading around them. And they were an amazing couple. Absolutely fascinating. And
so they were at the sort of, 19...
They married in 1912.
Yeah.
So they were at that sort of cusp of change. Society was changing a bit. It's a bit freer. And they were the it couple. I mean, it sounds really crass to say they were like Posh and Becks, but they were absolutely who you'd want to invite to dinner. Who you'd want to sit, if you were Chips Channon, who you'd have for supper. And their wedding was attended by the great and good of society. It was in all the newspapers. But I think the important thing, and this is as particularly true of Marjorie, is it wasn't about being a glamorous, sort of bright young thing and the chatelaine of a great house and head of a great family. It was about someone who had great depth. She was an artist. She was a writer. She made it her business to know interesting people, not to show off, because they're kind of private as well, you know.
Yeah.
But to create this kind of Camelot at Plas Newydd and have these friends round, they befriended all sorts of people and artists, famously Rex Whistler. And
I think, Marjorie's legacy for me and that Rex Whistler painting, and it's, what's it called again, the Rex Whistler painting? It's called
It's a big, this is when I pronounce it wrong.
In the dining room.
Capriccio. So it's like Capriccio. A fantasy view of boats, and it fills the dining room. And Rex Whistler painted himself into the picture as the gardener.
Oh, did he?
And then brilliantly, the seventh Marquis is in it as well, as a little boy peeing against a pillar. Which, can you imagine as kids how joyous it would be, you know, finding that little, not like those great Thornhills and amazing Verrio murals that you're used to seeing from the 18th century at houses like Burley and Chatsworth. But, you know, a mural very modern.
That's what I mean. I think that is arguably one of my favourite murals I've ever seen, because it's positioning, because the dining room at Plas Newydd sits directly opposite the lake, so it gets that kind of late in the afternoon light. I think I'm right in saying. And I just remember being in Plas Newydd, looking at this Rex Whistler painting, knowing that my great aunt had commissioned it because she was great friends with Whistler, and thinking, this is why we love these places, because and the fact that they still have survived, you know, after the litany of losses, you know, post World War II and Industrial Revolution. Thank goodness, because actually there's something very moving about standing in that dining room. And I think that dining room was once upon a time 3 servants' quarters that she knocked through and turned into the dining room. And I find I agree that their duo, following on from the fifth Marquis, is a fascinating one.
It's acknowledged as Rex Whistler's greatest work. You know, it really is a very, very important series of panels. You know, they're painted on canvas, actually. It's the largest canvas.
I didn't know
It is one of the largest canvases ever painted. But it sort of sits on 3 sides, and then there's these wonderful arched windows. So you feel like you're in an open loggia, and as you say, the water's in front of you. But if I was on the side of the table facing away from the windows, you'd be kind of just gazing at that picture. And, you know, people be going, sorry, David, I'm sorry, what? I was just looking at and Rex Whistler portrayed the family pets. You just dive into it, you know, your soup would get cold.
Yeah, so true.
You know, and you imagine the conversation that was around that table, the people that would be there, you know, so to say that would be, you know.
Yeah, they really did have a litany of fascinating friends. Well, that book might end up one day writing itself, I hope.
Yes.
I hope so. But that's so fascinating, David. So thank you. I'm so glad that you chose Plas Newydd. And the moment I saw that you had picked it, I was like, yes, because that really is, you know, an incredible...
It's an amazing house. And I think I urge people who are in Anglesey to go, actually, because the grounds are spectacular and the views, you know, it feels particularly Welsh.
Yeah, I agree.
But the characters that populated, think of it like going into a theatre, and it's the set, the backdrop to the most extraordinary personalities.
Well, thank you. That we really went into great depth on Plas Newydd, but it kind of deserves it because it is 100%. Incredible. And the kitchen gardens, I think I'm right in saying, are also very special to go and see. So it's well worth going and having a wander around. But now we come to the, you know, the sort of the future, you know, like, I think it's so interesting to think about your role specifically in single house ownership collections, but also Sotheby's more broadly, because, you know, do you think there will still be great collectors in the future?
Absolutely. And there are people who are collecting today who come into us and go to our competitors and buy at auction and create their own sets. And there are people who inherit collections and add to them. And I think that's really exciting. And I think that narrative of continuing, I'm as excited by seeing an amazing Julia Opie painting or, you know, an Edmund de Waal ceramic vase as I am to seeing a 17th century Dutch tulip vase in a great house, because it shows that continuation and that life, that blood coming in, and that pattern of collecting and
that character,
work.
Yes, because you know, a collection fundamentally is it's a piece of that person's individual character.
It's not like an important national collection where it's like, right, we need an example of that. That's a perfect example of that piece of silver. That spoon is significant because it was made in Exeter in the late 16th century. This is like, oh yeah, I got that spoon to use. Yeah. You know what I mean? Oh, it's from Exeter, or, you know, or this Lucian Freud's brilliant because he stayed in the house and he painted me, and then this is the paintbrushes that he used, but it's next to a Batoni of the 5th Duke of Devonshire and a sergeant of the Devonshire sisters. You know, it's it's quite magical.
Yeah. Can you just put into words, I guess, like what do you think, you know, Sotheby's, I know it's a commercial entity and role, but I guess more personally for you, like what does it mean to have dedicated 20 years so far, plus 20 years?
It's been a long time.
To what you do?
I think the objects are powerful, and I love the beauty and the history associated with an item. But for me, it's always about the story and creating a narrative. And sometimes it might be making sure that that person is out there properly, or, you know, there's a group of people that might know about Toppy, the fifth Marquis of Anglesey, but having objects associated with them and talking about them is quite, you know, it's amazing. It can be understanding why Vivian Lee's bracelet, we did an amazing sale of her property, has a little gold badge on it that relates to Gone with the Wind, or Marilyn Monroe's picnic hamper, or Nelson's teapot. They're all beautiful objects in their own right, but often it's that ownership and that story and how they fitted into those lives. I was very fortunate last year, we did a big sale of property from the collection of Freddie Mercury, who created his own kind of country house. And if you like, built his own narrative about what he was buying in quite a short space of time. And I wonder, he knew he was very poorly, and I wonder if he was creating, I don't know, it was definitely a world. We called the sale a world of his own, because everything came from this incredible house surrounded by high brick walls in Earl's Court, which fans go to and they write on the door. And
really?
It's one of those houses that tour buses go past to say, oh, this was Freddie Mercury's home. But beyond those high walls and going through one of those green doors was one of the great privileges of my life. This was a house that wasn't open to the public or had never been photographed or discussed. This was a world that completely beautifully looked after and cared for by Mary Austin, who was his great friend, and he left everything to Mary. But there were his collections from Japan. He loved Japan. There were his stage costumes. There were the working lyrics to the songs that we hear every day, you know. There were, and I wasn't a massive Queen fan, but I really grew to love Freddie Mercury. I just thought, wow, he created this sanctuary, this sacred space. He filled it with beautiful things that spoke to about various moments in his life or his travels or his career or moments of inspiration. And it was a party palace, you know, it was a place to come for his pals. And yet when he became very poorly, this small part of Earl's Court was his quiet sanctuary. As he got more and more poorly, it really became a fortress, if you like. And he could gaze at these objects that he'd collected throughout his life, or his working life, sketch them. He was an artist. He went to art college. So that power, the resonance, you know, was palpable. And when we had the exhibition in the galleries, it was extraordinary. The people that came in, you know, queuing for hours and hours and hours right round our block in New Bond Street. It was incredible. 120,000 people came into our galleries.
Wow.
And seeing the way that react, people were crying. And I initially was like, oh yeah, you know, he's amazing. But then when I understood why, so you'd say to someone, are you okay? You know, would you like to sit down or anything? And they'd say, oh, you know, we played this at my partner's funeral, or I danced to my wedding to this song, or I held my first child and we had this in the background. It's really affecting, you know. So that was it was a very unique privilege. I feel quite emotional talking about it. And I'm just the guy trying to vlog this stuff, but it was
but you
so
get
special.
Collections, but you get the value of what this means. I mean, I'm so struck when I was listening to you just then. What do you think, like becoming a collector of any description, of any size, of any material substance, it says something about legacy for me. It says something about the preservation of oneself in the items that we spend our lives kind of gathering around us. And I think there's no better vivid image of that than what you just described with Mercury. This idea of him having had all these outrageously fun parties in this place in Earl's Court, to then actually quietly kind of, you know, fading, but in the surroundings of his great collection and his legacy.
It was very interesting, that point about legacy. So there was discussion, you know, people were like, it should be a museum and it should be like, you know, Handel's house. He was adamant that he didn't want people walking around his rooms. He didn't want that sort of roped off.
No.
He was really funny about it. And he wanted everything thrown out. And he loved auctions. He loved the theatre of buying at auction. So he'd come into Sotheby's, the doors would be closed. He'd come in after hours, And he'd explore the galleries.
Wow.
And then he'd be on the telephone, or his assistant would be on the telephone, or Mary would be on the telephone bidding for him. And he loved that sort of the process.
Camaraderie of it all, I guess.
The camaraderie and the theatre and the drama and the camp, should I say, camp possibly? The kind of putting his hand up in the sale room, or not that he ever came to sale room, but that, that
would have been amazing.
That whole thing appealed to him enormously. I think having that moment, that bit of a flash, that one window when everything was on view, was quite him. The sort of greatest hits, you listen to it and then you quietly put it away. And I think for the people that came to the exhibition, I hope that they really felt that in a way, that moment, that it had to be a moment. It was almost like one of his projects, it was like a performance, like Live Aid, you had that moment and then it's finished.
Yeah.
And I think the collection sort of needed that.
Yeah.
And he loved Sotheby's. I mean, one of the reasons that we were very fortunate and so honored to get it, just before we were talking to the family, my colleague found a quote in an interview with Freddie in the 1980s. And he said, the only thing I should ever miss if I was to leave the UK would be Sotheby's. So we had that. What a quote. I mean, come on, amazing. So we shared that. And it feels
very cool. Because you are who you are, and you've had the role that you've had at Sotheby's for plus 20 years. Your house must, I imagine, I have like vivid images in my mind as to what your house might look like. Is there an incredible, what's your sort of favorite item if you could name one in your house?
Oh my goodness. So I hate anyone listening to think that I live in a series of staterooms or I have this incredible, it's so grand. And actually a colleague a while ago said to me, you're so lucky you get to see the best of the best. And then you realize when you're at home that I'm never going to be able to have that because I couldn't possibly afford to buy it, or I would have the copy of Julia Chatterley's Lover that was used by the judge in the obscenity trial. So, I make do, does that make sense? I have things that were in my family but nothing very precious or valuable. But I think things that I've traveled with, I like that, I loved Catcher in the Rye, the book, and I remember annotating a copy as a teenager. It's not a very important historical document because my brother's a self-indulgent teenage claptrap. Yeah. If you imagine.
Yeah.
But I, thought I was Holden Caulfield, like lots of teenage boys when they read Catcher in the Rye. And I was traveling in India. My English teacher was working out there and she had it bound in leather for me when I'd left some stuff at her house and gave it to me. So it was quite significant and special, that object, because it's a book, but it's also an object. You know.
Interesting. My final question before we move on to your final place that you're going to share with us, and I think it's a beautiful garden, which I'm so excited to hear more about. But if there's a message that you could share with, future generations or people that are listening and thinking, I want to start collecting, and I'm interested in Sotheby's, can anyone go to Sotheby's? And also, what would you advise to future generations about collecting?
Oh, so that's good. So anyone can come into Sotheby's. It's free of charge. You can come in and you can go on the website and think, oh, look, they've got Japanese prints on view. I'll go and have a look at those. Or they've got English 18th century furniture. You can go in. It's free. You can have a coffee in the coffee shop. It's brilliant. It's one of those great secrets. You're in Oxford Street or on Bond Street. You're feeling a bit tired. Go and get a bit of art therapy. And it's so much quieter than our great galleries and museums.
I agree with
it's
that.
a lovely place to go. If you're collecting, I always think you've got to collect things that mean something. I think having a tick box of, okay, Picasso, Chagall, Miro, it's much better to
be moved by something.
Yeah, and absolutely. And to have a group of postcards from museums that you've been to traveling around the world, maybe those are more significant than owning works by the actual artists because you've experienced the work, you've bought the postcard. You might find a stone on the beach that you remember, and to come across that in a drawer, maybe that's more rewarding at home than having a silver snuff box.
Yeah, so true.
Anyway, yeah.
No, I love that. I think that's wonderful advice. And so, David, for your final recommendation and favourite destination from today, where is it and what is it?
I was very lucky. We're talking about family in a house. So there's the most extraordinary house called Spetchley in Worcestershire. If you close your eyes and imagine a sandstone country house, it's exactly like that. It's got a portico with columns at the front. It's got the big windows on the ground floor, sort of triangular pediment at the top. The most gorgeous coloured stone in Worcestershire. It's not far from Worcester. And it's lived in by the Berkeley family. Branch, they have Berkeley Castle and they have Spetchley. And we spent a lot of time working up there. We did a sale. Again, it was sort of things from the attics and cellars and stores to help restore the house. And it's a proper family home. So the house isn't open to the public, but the gardens are, and they're glorious. And again, I think it reflects my love of characters, eccentric characters. There was an amazing woman called Ellen Wilmot, who was a great horticulturist. She was friends with Gertrude Jekyll. She was an Edwardian lady who was an obsessive collector.
Who was Gertrude Jekyll?
A garden designer.
Okay.
Yeah. Ellen Wilmot, basically, her sister married into the Berkeley family. So she would spend a lot of time there. And both women actually were keen horticulturists. They loved gardening. And they loved planting. Ellen created her own amazing gardens at Worley Place, another house in Essex. But Spetchley spoke to her particularly because the gardens were very historic. They were very old. They'd been there since, they were sort of laid out in the 17th century and then changed in the 19th century. Wow. Great big cypress trees. There's a big, big lake. Lovely old red brick walls around the gardens. Anyway, there was something about the hands-on approach of these two Edwardian ladies planting and sort of loving their gardens. And Ellen was particularly outspoken. She was a real character. And she was said to carry a pistol in her muff.
Love
that. She was quite, and her tiara and her handbag. So
hang on, what period of time was she? Sorry.
She was sort of 1900s.
Okay.
In the 1920s.
Okay.
She was so obsessed with flowers and planting, she got into terrible financial trouble. I mean, she wasn't great with money. She was always on expeditions, hunting for seeds.
Wow.
And flowers and things. And a lot of those things ended up at Spetchley. And the gardens are open to the public and you can get a real sense of Ellen Wilmot there. And if ever there was another character where there's a film or a book.
Her.
And in fact, I think there is a book actually that's just come out about her, which is worth reading.
Oh, wow.
So I can't remember off the top of my head what it's called or who it's published by, but it's a really good read.
We'll link it.
Yeah, send the reading, Ellen Wilmot. But
Okay.
there's something about her that's sort of quite magical. She used to carry in her pocket seeds for this particular flower, and it's called Ellen Wilmot's Ghost. So she would go to gardens and she would scatter just quietly at her thing. So in every garden there'd be they're like a sort of white ghostly kind of thistle.
Oh,
so I think that's quite a sort of magical thing. You can imagine this lady.
I think there's a bit of legacy
bit of legacy there.
That's amazing.
So she's keenly felt, although she was never the chatelaine at Spetchley, she's sort of, for me, absolutely connected to it. And when she passed away, all of her things went to Spetchley.
Okay.
To her sister and
God,
her
amazing.
brother-in-law.
I'd never heard of her. That's
She's
such a gift.
quite a character.
Yeah.
She's almost like an Ian Foster character.
Yeah. And also what a gift she was to Spetchley, like to create those gardens.
Yeah.
I can't wait to, I'm definitely going to go and visit them.
That's a really lovely one. And they've got, again, great tea room, etc. So it's really close to Worcester. But really special, lovely, the most wonderful gardens.
Oh my gosh. Well, David, honestly, I think you've given 3 of the best recommendations and described them in the most beautiful way that only you could. And then B, like, what a treat to learn from you about these incredible collections. And I actually am yet to have felt as moved as I have speaking to you about some of them today. So I really thank you so much. And such a treat for our listeners to just have a slice of your knowledge and sort of wisdom of collecting and the great kind of house sales that have gone on over the years. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. And I think it sounds such a cheesy thing to say, but you're only ever as good as the things that you see or the stuff you get, so I'm incredibly lucky that I get to meet extraordinary people and see wonderful things. They're not my things, they're not my houses, but just to be a tiny part of that and unlock the key or be there to hold the door open is special.
David, where can people find you and learn more about you? You've got Instagram.
I'm on Instagram, absolutely. And also you can email me. My details are on Sotheby's website. And else please email me to correct. I'm sure in my waffle there's been a few erroneous dates.
No, I think
Marcus characters and things like that. So do email me. But yeah, our website is great. And you can see all the videos that we've made in the past. And if you want to hear more of me, you can look at some I've done a few videos and things for Sotheby's on the Mountbatten. We sold property from the estate of the Countess of Mountbatten, so that's on YouTube. And then obviously talking about Freddie Mercury more recently.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. You can learn more about Sotheby's and the work that they do visiting their website, www.sotheby's.com. If you want to find out more about the work we're doing at Heritage X, book your visit at one of the UK's most historic houses through our platform. You can find us on www.heritageexplore.com.